Hey everyone, I'm super happy to be here and share this. I feel like the table's kind of been set for me with the work on spiritual warfare that we've already done, and then Graham's presentation on prayer. I'm going to do something kind of counterintuitive, and I'm going to go back to the very beginning today. If you've looked at your papers, you see that I'm going to be in Genesis 2. And this is a place that God has taken me for actually quite a few years. And I don't know when it was, but I was struggling with some things in my marriage and my understanding. And I felt like God started impressing on me. He was like, Carla, if you're going to be so upset about it, why don't you ask me? Carla, if you're going to be so upset about it, why don't you ask me? And I don't hear a verbal voice. It's not that but I had this impression, and it was like shocking for me at first, right? And I was like, I can't do that. I don't know, right? I'm so upset about this. And so then eventually he opened a thing or two to me and led me down this path. And I hope some of this is a blessing to you. I hope that you see some things in a new way. I'm not changing any of your understanding of Genesis 2, but I hope I'm opening the window a little wider so you can see a little more of not only who you are, but who God is and his heart for you. So we talk about peace, harmony, and wholeness in marriage here, and that is what we want to get to. So I'm calling this the Ezer mystery. Raise your hand if you have ever heard that word Ezer. Does that Ezer word mean anything to you? I don't know if wow, not too many. Okay. So that's actually a transliteration of a Hebrew word, and that's what we're going to get into. But I'm using this mystery to say, I know this is going to feel counterintuitive at first. I'm going to tell you a story, but I want you to see where it comes from in Genesis so that you know a little more of the story God is telling you, right? So I'm sort of starting right in the middle. I'm dumping you in the middle of Genesis 2. You are familiar with the creation story. God's already made the original man. He's put Adam in this garden. He's created this, everything he needs, and he puts him here in the middle of the garden, and he says, I give you two jobs. Right? Oh, I should have forwarded that so I saw that first. So our stories are important, right? Our stories are important because we're meaning makers. And there's been lots of research on this. And the stories you tell yourself in your head and the stories you tell yourself about what's going on impact the way you live. Not just what you think, but what you do and how you feel and what you're able to do or not able to do. The stories of your parents, or the stories you tell yourself about God or about yourself, right? We make sense of life through our stories. And that's what I think is happening here in Genesis 2. God is trying to say, I want to help you make sense of what's going on. So back to Adam, here in the middle of the garden. God gives him two jobs. And I think that this is often overlooked, right? This is often overlooked because in probably your translation, if you have it, Adam is told to work and keep the garden. That's the way most translations translate it. And those two tasks, right? Work is like a cultivate word. It's like gardening or farming or taking care of things. It's what you would expect. But that keep word, I think if you hear it in English, you might think of keeping house or picking up a rock and deciding, I'm going to keep it, right? It's kind of a little bit protective and a little take care of it. And so we kind of read right over it. But I think that God is actually warning of danger. Usually we don't see danger in Genesis till we get to Genesis 3, right? At the beginning of Genesis 3, the serpent is more crafty than any serpent of any beast of the field, right? But that word that's translated keep in Genesis 2 shows up next in the narrative at the end of Genesis 3, when God takes this cherubim after the fall, and he puts him by the tree of life with a flaming sword that turns every way to guard the way to the tree of life, right? Same word in Hebrew, translated keep into translated guard in Genesis 3. So if we were to take kind of that, of course, keep can be protective also, right? Like the keep of a castle, but it's not the way we usually use it. And I think God is actually saying two things. Adam, you're my representative here. You're representing me. You're presenting me. You're the regent here. So take care of it, but also protect it. There's danger. So God is warning him of danger. And as a matter of fact, the very next verse is, and I forgot that I was supposed to print this out because I know most of you don't have your Bibles, but the very next verse is where God warns him not to eat of the tree because the day you eat of it, you will surely die, right? Take care of it, guard it, specific warning of how to guard it. Very next verse, if you have it, I'd love to have you see it there. Very next verse says, it is not good for the man to be alone. So we have this danger sense. And then God, who said everything was good. Everything's good, right? It's good. It's good. It's very good. Everything he's made is good. And God says, whoa, not good. Something's not good. I don't think God ever says whoa, but something's not good. And what's not good? It's not good that this man is alone. If we had time, I'd have you talk at your tables, but I think I'm going to take a little too long, so I put it as a question later. You can start thinking about it. What are the times when it's not good for a person to be alone? Your own life, your stories you watch on TV, or, your kids, your family. We all know times when it's not good to be alone, right? And actually, I think all four of these categories show up in the text here. But I'm wondering what it is that God really wants there, right? So obviously, Adam has this huge task, this monumental task. Take care of this whole world. Fill it, subdue it, right? Big job. When we have a huge job, we often need some help. I think if we read it, we just read it out of context. It's not good for the man to be alone. A lot of us think loneliness, right? We're made in the image of God. Yes, we're relational, and we need other people. That's why solitary confinement is bad, right? We're not made for it. So I think that's there too. He has emotional needs. Is that what God means? Obviously, he needs a partner for procreation if he's going to fill this, be fruitful and multiply, right? That's there too. But I don't think too often we read another time that it's bad to be alone is if you're in danger, right? If I'm walking through New York City late at night all by myself and I hear someone behind me or something behind me, and I walk faster and it speeds up, and I start running and it speeds up more, right? It's not good for me to be alone. My heart is racing by then. I'd love to find a policeman or, somebody to protect me. Or, any place, anything where you are in danger. You'd like to not be alone. You'd like to have somebody there who's on your side, right? And I think that danger thread, you see, I think, continues through the narrative. God says, not good. Why do I think that? God says, okay, I will make him a helper suitable for him. That helper word in Hebrew is Ezer, spelled E-Z-E-R up there. Sometimes I've heard Ezer, but most often Ezer. And we translate it helper everywhere it shows up in the Old Testament. So it shows up 21 times in this form in the Old Testament. You could look this up if you like to do research. But actually, I listed them all there so it's easy to see because I want to know what kind of helper this is, right? Twice here in Genesis 2, it refers to the woman. So I'm going to set those aside. I want to find out what that means. So there's 19 times remaining, and 16 of them, it refers to God. 16 times God says something like, Moses names his son Eliezer because he says, the God of my father is my help, and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. Don't worry, I'm going back. And hear, O Israel, hear, O Lord, and be a help against his enemies. And if you read all 16 of those, in almost every one, you would find it's also in relationship to an enemy. David's overwhelmed, but God's my helper, right? Moses would have been stuck in Pharaoh, in Egypt with Pharaoh, but God was his helper, right? Our soul waits for the Lord. He is our help, Ezer, and our shield, right? There's a battle going on almost every single one of the times that this shows up. There's a few more, but I just want you to be convinced that this is almost always, that Ezer word is almost always like a warrior battleground word. It's not just an assistant. When we read the word helper in English, we think assistant, right? Maybe junior partner, someone who does your secretarial work for you, or maybe mommy's little helper, right? If we go really far. So 16 times it refers to God. What about the remaining 3? Twice it refers to a nation that Israel has called on for aid when they are stuck, right? They're scared, an enemy's coming against them, they go, they need a helper. And so they call on, Isaiah 30 is the clearest one of those, and I put it there at the bottom. And it's actually God talking to Israel. And he's saying, basically, why did you go to Egypt for your Ezer? Kind of, who am I? Right? Therefore, the protection of Pharaoh will turn to your shame. Something's cut off there, right? He brings neither help nor profit, I think is what the end of that verse says. So, there is an obscure one or two. Daniel is extremely obscure. I have no idea what's going on there. So God says, I will make him a helper. I'll make him a warrior, corresponding to him, equal to him, suitable to him, standing eye to eye with him, right? So, what does God do? How does he do this, right? The next thing it says is so God takes one of his selahs. Again, I'm using the Hebrew word because we're so familiar with it in English, right? In English, we translate it here, rib. So, and if you looked it up, it would say number one answer is rib, but this word, I can't break this all down for you because it takes too long, but it shows up 41 times in the Old Testament, and it is usually an architectural or building word. Why do I care about that, right? It's usually about them building the temple or the tabernacle, but it's not making something new. It's using materials that you already have to create something, to build something more, right? And God says, so he takes whatever this is, this selah, we're used to thinking of it as a rib, but it's, when you're talking about the temple, the tabernacle, it's usually the side of something, right? They attached these poles to the sides of the Ark of the Covenant so that the priests could carry it through the wilderness. They cover the selahs of the temple with gold, the walls, maybe the sides, right? Often, or there are these chambers around the temple that are like presumably on the sides. And I think that it's much more likely that God is actually takes the whole side out of Adam. I want that picture at least as a possibility in your mind, because God says he closes up the place with flesh. I think we often think it's kind of like surgery. God kind of like takes out a rib, stitches it up. Adam's the same as he was before. Just take this rib and do this magical thing, right? But God has to close up the place with flesh, some of him is gone. So, and in fact, when Adam sees her walking toward him later, he's like, whoa, right? This is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. I knew something was different. There she is. That's what happened. My other half. She's coming toward me. That's cool, right? So I think this is a really beautiful picture and full of mystery that, the original, God makes this prototype human, this original man, and says, will you obey me? What if he's already under temptation? What if he's already thinking about it? What if he falls before she comes along? What if? Well, I'm hypothesizing, but the way God brings rescue eventually is through the woman, right? Jesus is born of a woman. In fact, if you read in Genesis 3, when he's making his promises, it's the seed of the woman. That's interesting. I never noticed that before, right? So you have this original human, and if God splits him in half, makes the second, brings her back, you originally had one, right? Splits her into two, him into two. Then he brings him back, and it's one. He's one, but he's two, but he's one. Now you're one flesh, but you're two, but you're one. Sound like anything else you've heard in the Bible? Remind you of the Trinity in any way, right? I'm not saying we're like God, but I think there is some mystery here. God is one, but he's three. But he's one, but he's three. We could spend a lot of time on that and not understand it. It's a mystery. In fact, I think this is even further supported that God is after rescue when he creates the woman, when he makes the woman, because he's preparing for ultimate redemption. She's not going to be the rescuer. As a matter of fact, we find out the next chapter, she doesn't do so great at that, right? But God is moving already. He sees the need of the man before the man sees it. And he moves in. In fact, after he brings the woman back to the man, he says, therefore shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one. You're very familiar with this. I don't know if you're aware that this is quoted 3 times in the New Testament. That's a lot. A lot of verses are later explained in the New Testament after God says, actually, you thought this was about Israel being a suffering servant. Actually, that was Jesus. And so those verses are quoted and explained to us later on, and we see them. It's like this progressive revelation of God and who he is and what he's doing. So in Matthew and Mark, those are both Jesus talking to the Pharisees about divorce. But in Ephesians 5, Paul is talking about kind of the household codes. If you're familiar with that chapter on, wives submitting, husbands loving, and he goes off on this huge tangent about how much Jesus loved the church and how he, washes her with the word, and it's kind of, he gets way up in the clouds talking about the amazing love of God. Then he quotes this verse again. He says, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Next verse says, Paul says, this mystery is profound, but I am saying it refers to Christ and his church. Always I have got kind of jumped back over that and gone back to the beginning and been like, oh yeah, all that stuff about how much Jesus loves, yeah, that's about Christ and his church. What if it's this verse that's talking about Christ and his church? What if when God did it at the beginning, he's saying, who's going to be the rescuer? here's a little image, right? So in our picture with this man, separated into two and then one brought back, wouldn't you think that if this, here's the original, separate out the second, bring her back, you'd say, therefore, the woman should leave her father and mother, right? He doesn't. He says, therefore, the man. Who left his father to rescue his bride? It wasn't the bride who scrambled her way to her groom, right? Jesus left his father to be united to his bride in this amazing mystery. And I think this is unbelievable. When I first saw this, I was like, wow. God is moving before we even know, right? I think of God, so they fall, they make their sin. God's like, okay, I'll rescue. But no. This good and generous God is actually rescuing in advance. So wives in particular, I want to call you today, but I'm talking to all of you. I want to call you to embrace your high calling as Ezer. If you read that Genesis 2 passage, I will make him a helper suitable for him. Don't think assistant. Don't think I'm just here to support him. I'm all for supporting him, right? I mean, I'm not talking against submission or leadership or love or anything, but I don't think it's what it says. It says Adam's in danger. God's moving in advance to rescue. See your amazing, generous God who, before you even need it, before you even call, he's like, yep, I'm going to rescue. I'm going to rescue. So we need to tell ourselves better stories. Here, I hope that somebody is like, wow, has some of that reaction that I had. Wow. That is a story to tell myself that God moves before I even need, before I even ask, before I realize I need. My God is moving, right? And he's moving in love because he loves us. So your own identity, your spouse's identity, what are the things he calls you in the New Testament? Saint, beloved of the Father, child of the King, collectively, the church, the bride of Christ. So we need to tell ourselves better stories, especially if we're struggling. I also kind of want you to see, as I've emphasized this warrior word, I want to put in your mind the idea that this Ezer can be like a battle buddy. Or I think I put good soldier inverted there on your page. So this is definitely has some warrior connotations. There's a battle against this man, and he needs a warrior. He needs a battle buddy, right? If you have anybody who's in the army, they may talk about having a battle buddy, somebody in particular you're assigned to, who you're going to look out for. You're going to have their back. You're particularly aware of what they need. If anything happens to you, they're looking out for you. If anything happens to them, you're looking out for them, and you're not going to leave them behind. And it makes us aware that the enemy's coming this way. And if we're wasting our energy this way, I'm fighting with Graham, when the enemy's actually attacking me, I'm pretty exposed, right? I can't fight back very well. So I want you to see that God gave you to each other to be battle buddies, to look out for each other, to fight the battle against you together. I just put up there to prepare in advance, and that's actually what I'm going to talk about. This builds nicely on Amy's spiritual warfare. So how do we fight the battles that are against us? For one thing, we prepare in advance. We never throw a soldier into the middle of the battle and be like, oh yeah, by the way, here's your gun, hope you know how to use it. Look out for They have to be trained, or they're just going to be completely overwhelmed. So in the same way, we also need to prepare in advance. You have a tremendous amount of power in your spouse's life, whether you believe that or not. And I know that we're all over the map here. Sometimes you can really feel this. They're listening to you. They're easily influenced. You can speak good into their lives easily. Sometimes I think we've probably all had at least moments where you're like, this is useless. He doesn't listen to me anyway. I don't know. Maybe I'm just speaking out of my own experience. But you do have a tremendous amount of power in your marriage, and we want to use it for good. How do you do that? Be your spouse's cheerleader. When do we need a cheerleader the most? It's great when we make a touchdown and everybody's cheering and the crowd's going wild and you're feeling great anyways, and the cheerleaders are like, yay, right? But what about when the other team makes the touchdown and you're feeling terrible? The cheerleaders, if you're in high school, still spring into action, right? That's okay, all right, that's okay, we're going to beat them anyway, or whatever. When do you need the encouragement the most? Think of yourself instead of your spouse, right? What if you've had a terrible day and you've screamed at the kids, or you've, I don't know, lost your job, or you feel like you've given up hope, or you're sick and you're feeling terrible? That's often, doesn't it mean the most if he comes in then and he's like, wow, I see you're feeling really poorly today. I believe in you. Why don't you go rest? I've got this, right? He can speak real words of life into me at that moment. And actually, you have that power too toward your spouse. So what I'm going to encourage you to do is very related to what Graham said last week, is to pray the promises of God over each other. And this is one way that you prepare in advance for the battle arrayed against you. If you've been married more than 6 months or a year or two, you know something about your spouse's weaknesses as well as their strengths. Maybe before you got married, you only saw the strengths, but sometime or other it shows up, and you're like, what? You do that? Right? So I want you to pray for each other, but I want us to learn to pray the opposite. Because sometimes we get stuck in these negative spirals, and I am super aware that, let's talk about myself. This is only a sample, right? There could be probably hundreds of these, and I came up with the opposites, and you can see that they're kind of fluid and they can be used for each other. But I tend toward fear and anxiety. I get anxious about stuff, right? So Graham is aware of this. He could talk to me about that and be like, wow, I see you're really anxious. You need to be strong and courageous because that's what God wants. You're like, I know that, but I can't, right? So what if you started praying the opposite into your spouse's life? Whatever their weakness is. Let's say they struggle with workaholism. Tim talked about this morning. What if you prayed contentment over your spouse? What if you prepared in advance, you went to the Word of God and you said, I know this is a struggle that he has. I know this is a struggle that she has. What do you say, God, about this? So that's the preparing in advance. And it takes a little bit of work, but you know these things about each other. And if you're in a good enough place, you can have these conversations. I was like, wow, that's big. Right? Maybe he's in a small group that prays for each other. I hope so. I think that's great. But you have this tremendous ability to kind of see into his life. And he has this tremendous ability to see into your life. So men, I'm talking to you too. You are also the battle buddy, the Ezer for your wife, right? One thing we're doing is we're praying in the ultimate Ezer, Jesus, who can actually fix things, but I get to be a part of it. I get to be actively praying about it and see him change. Not that I'm waiting for that, right? But often you will see. If you start praying power into your spouse's life, you will see change. Probably. God works in mysterious ways. And you're like invited into that. So for instance, I struggle with anxiety. I put Joshua 1:9 here. This is a favorite verse. Be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened and do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Turn that into prayer for a spouse who's anxious, right? God, you promise that you are with us everywhere we go. Thank you for being with my spouse. May she be strong and courageous today. May he be aware of what you're doing. God has not given us a spirit of of fear, but of power and love and self-control. God, will you make him aware that your spirit of power and love and self-control abides in him. Help him see it. This one I already kind of changed around. There are multiple ways to do this. There's nothing magic about this. This is what Graham talked about last week. But I think especially women who tend to be more verbal than a lot of our men. Not always, but it tends to be. When we get frustrated, it's easy to kind of speak I want to say speak death, right? Why are you always... I've done it. Trust me, I've done it. What if I use this power for good? I've given you some questions there at the end that I'm going to give your table some time to talk about. And then I've also written out some homework. I put a bunch of verses on there just for anybody who feels like, I don't know where to start. Anybody who feels overwhelmed, I wanted you to have a place to start. But there's nothing magic about these verses. They're just ones that occurred to me. And they are examples of praying the opposite in. So let's say you want to pray courage into your spouse. There's a few options. What jumps out at you? What do you think the Lord is saying to you? And if it's possible, I say on the homework, talk about this together. What would you like me to pray into your life this summer? What would you like to see God doing? It's a little vulnerable. So if they're exposing their weaknesses to you, you're going to be really careful with that and really supportive, right? We are not here to tear each other down. We're here to build each other up in Jesus. And so there are some questions there at the end to talk about. And I hope the last thing on the homework is ask a friend to check in with you weekly or semi-weekly through the summer to see if you keep at it. It's so easy to start something and then you get busy or you forget, something happens, you get mad, and we quit. So if you bring someone else in and say, hey, I'm trying to pray for my husband this summer. Will you just check with me once a week, once every 2 weeks? Ask me if I'm still doing it. Tiny bit of accountability. You don't have to tell them anything personal if you don't want to. Just have them check in with you. Hey, how's it going? Oh, I haven't been doing it. Okay, I'll start again. Right. So I hope some of that is a blessing to you, and I hope you have a conversation about that around the table. You have about 25 minutes, and I think it'd be great to talk for 15 or 20 minutes, and then break into couples if you're comfortable. I understand also that prayer is a very intimate thing, and some people have a lot of trouble with it. So we're just trying to encourage you wherever you are on the journey. If you can't do this together, maybe you can talk about it, and you can pray for each other separately. But believe. It's like a faith journey. You can believe in what God is doing. God promises to be with us. God promises he'll be with your husband or your wife. And he promises that he's strong and very courageous. That is actually biblical. You can pray that, even if you don't see it at all. God, he's strong and courageous because of the Spirit that's living in him. Help him see it. Help me see it. Help me call it out of him, right? Help me be a faithful warrior or battle buddy for him. So, all right. Thank you very much.